The historical struggle for educational freedom, the right to independently access, question, and expand upon knowledge, reveals a stark reality. For over 2 millennia, the simple act of reading a philosophical text or questioning the cosmos was a privilege guarded by ruling powers. In his work, The Oak Matrix Unleashed, specifically Chapter 11, author Joe Bandel argues that self-education is a fundamental tool for personal liberation, one that has survived centuries of institutional suppression thanks to hidden networks and ancient wisdom traditions. Bandel traces this lineage from the mystery schools of ancient Egypt through the Dark Ages, highlighting secret societies like the Rosicrucians and Freemasons as preservers of intellectual autonomy. The core thesis suggests that breaking free from external control requires a deliberate pursuit of foundational knowledge.
Bandel's framework forces us to look at history not just as a sequence of empires, but as a continuous battleground for the human mind. When we examine the ancient world, particularly Egypt around 1350 BCE, we see early examples of radical paradigm shifts in thought. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who later changed his name to Akhenaten, initiated a massive religious and cultural upheaval. He centralized worship around a single deity, the Aten, represented by the sun disk, creating the first documented form of state-sponsored monotheism. Egyptologists like James K. Hoffmeyer and Donald Redford have documented in detail how Akhenaten dismantled the powerful priesthood of Amun-Ra in Thebes and built an entirely new capital city, Akhetaten, now known as Amarna. This was a profound disruption of the established intellectual and spiritual order.
That specific historical pivot is fascinating because it is often romanticized as a moment of spiritual liberation, yet the historical record paints a more complex picture. Akhenaten's revolution was a top-down mandate. He closed traditional temples, ordered the names of other gods, chiseled off public monuments, and positioned himself and his family as the sole intermediaries between the divine and the populace. If we are examining the roots of educational and spiritual freedom, Akhenaten looks less like a liberator of the common mind and more like an authoritarian consolidating power. The mystery schools associated with Heliopolis might have fostered advanced learning in astronomy, mathematics, and healing, as Bandel notes, but that knowledge remains sequestered among the royal and priestly classes.
The distinction between the historical reality of Akhenaten and the mythological legacy of his ideas is crucial here. While his actual reign was autocratic, the underlying concept, the existence of a singular, unifying principle behind the material world, became a cornerstone for later esoteric traditions. After Akhenaten's death, subsequent pharaohs dismantled his legacy, abandoning Amarna and attempting to erase him from the historical record. However, the conceptual shift toward a unified divine source echoed through time. Centuries later, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, European thinkers seeking alternatives to orthodox dogma looked back to Egypt. They viewed it as the cradle of an ancient, uncorrupted wisdom. This romanticized version of Egyptian knowledge became a foundational myth for the secret societies that would later emerge to protect independent thought.
Moving forward into the medieval period, the dynamics of knowledge control become even more pronounced. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Europe entered a prolonged era of intellectual restriction. Literacy rates plummeted. The written word became the exclusive domain of the clergy and monastic orders. The institutional church acted as the supreme gatekeeper of both secular and spiritual knowledge. The average person lived in a state of enforced ignorance, dependent entirely on ecclesiastical authorities to interpret scripture, law, and the natural world. Any deviation from accepted dogma was often met with harsh punitive measures, silencing generations of potential innovators.
We must acknowledge that the monastic system did preserve classical texts, copying manuscripts that might otherwise have been lost to time. The critical issue, however, was access. The texts were locked in scriptoriums written in Latin, a language the peasantry could not read or understand. This monopoly on information meant that independent philosophical inquiry was paralyzed for the masses. If an individual cannot access the foundational texts of history, science, or theology, they lack the basic tools required to challenge the prevailing power structures. This environment of intellectual stagnation is precisely what catalyzed the formation of clandestine networks. Thinkers, alchemists, and philosophers needed safe, hidden channels to explore concepts that the church deemed heretical, such as Hermeticism, which posited that humans could direct, understand, and manipulate the forces of nature.
This brings us to the emergence of the Rosicrucians in the early 17th century, a movement that seems to embody the pursuit of educational freedom out of the shadows. Between 1614 and 1615, a series of anonymous manifestos, starting with the Fama Fraternitatis and followed by the Confessio Fraternitatis, were published in Germany. These documents announce the existence of a secret brotherhood founded by a legendary, likely mythical figure named Christian Rosenkreuz. Aided by the invention of the printing press, the manifestos caused an uproar across Europe because they promised a universal reformation of arts, sciences, and religion, blending mysticism with early scientific inquiry.
The Rosicrucian phenomenon serves as a perfect case study in how knowledge acts as a subversive force against established hierarchies. The historian Frances Yates, in her extensive work on the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, emphasizes that their practice of alchemy was misunderstood by outsiders. They were not primarily concerned with the literal metallurgical transmutation of base metals into physical gold. Alchemy served as a complex, rich allegory for spiritual and intellectual refinement. The man of lead, burdened by ignorance, prejudice, and base desires, undergoes a rigorous process of purification through study, discipline, and the pursuit of hidden knowledge, eventually transforming into the enlightened man of gold. Medical doctors and philosophers, drawing on the teachings of the 16th century physician Paracelsus, integrated this inner alchemy with a desire to heal humanity.
The allegorical nature of that transformation is powerful because it shifts the locus of authority from the external institution to the internal discipline of the individual. However, the transmission of these complex ideas required sophisticated vehicles, which leads us to the evolution of Freemasonry. We observe a historical transition from operative masonry, the literal stonemason guilds that engineered and built the medieval cathedrals, to speculative masonry, which utilized the tools of the builder, like the square and compass, as symbols for moral and intellectual development. By the 18th century, Freemasonry had absorbed many of the esoteric currents flowing through Europe, including elements of Rosicrucianism.
The philosophical synthesis within Freemasonry is vast and intricate. As the organization expanded, particularly with the development of systems like the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, it incorporated a diverse array of ancient traditions. The influential Masonic scholar Albert Pike, in his 1871 comprehensive book, Morals and Dogma, provides an exhaustive analysis of these diverse influences. Pike indexed dozens of references to the Jewish Kabbalah, demonstrating how its mystical framework, detailing the emanations of the divine and the intricate structure of the cosmos, was woven into the higher Masonic degrees. The ritualistic search for the lost word in Masonry mirrors the Kabbalistic pursuit of restoring harmony and understanding to a fractured, chaotic world.
Beyond the Kabbalah, there is a distinct thread of Egyptomania running through these higher degrees, a fascination that predated but was amplified by Napoleon's military campaigns in Egypt and the subsequent discovery of the Rosetta Stone. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, figures like the Count of Cagliostro established specialized forms of Egyptian Freemasonry, leading to systems such as the Rite of Memphis Misram. They claimed to be the direct heirs of the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, tying their initiation rites back to the symbolic architecture of King Solomon's temple and the esoteric lore of the pharaohs. While historical evidence linking 18th century European fraternities to ancient Egyptian priests is non-existent, the utility of the myth is what matters here. It provided an alternative, authoritative historical narrative, one that bypassed the authority of the contemporary church and state.
The myth provided a vital protective lineage for these thinkers. By claiming descent from a revered antiquity, these individuals validated their pursuit of science, mathematics, and comparative religion. It was a sophisticated mechanism to safeguard educational freedom. Within the closed doors of the lodge, men from different social strata, religious backgrounds, and professions could meet as equals to discuss ideas that would have been censored or even punished by death in the public square. They were practicing an early form of intellectual democracy governed by reason, debate, and symbolism rather than divine right or ecclesiastical decree.
We must also scrutinize the structural irony inherent in these secret societies. Bandel positions them as champions of educational freedom, preserving vital knowledge for the eventual benefit of all humanity. Yet they operated through rigid hierarchies, strict oaths of secrecy, and exclusionary membership criteria. By keeping their philosophical and alchemical texts hidden behind thick veils of allegory and complex initiation rituals, they created a new esoteric elite. If the ultimate goal is the democratization of knowledge, freeing the average person from the chains of ignorance, hoarding that knowledge within a private, exclusive brotherhood seems contradictory to the premise of universal empowerment.
That tension is undeniable and represents a significant historical paradox. The secrecy was at first a practical, non-negotiable requirement for physical survival during an era marked by brutal inquisitions and bloody religious wars. Over time, however, the secrecy became a defining characteristic of the organizations themselves, often cultivating an air of elitism and exclusivity. Yet the core principle they managed to preserve was the fundamental methodology of rigorous inquiry. They maintained the dangerous idea that an individual, through dedicated study and ethical labor, could improve their own condition and, by extension, society at large. When the Enlightenment took hold across Europe, many of the scientific and philosophical concepts incubated within these private networks spilled out into the public domain, fueling the push for public education systems, scientific academies, and democratic forms of governance.
The environment has shifted in profound ways from the days when possessing a forbidden manuscript or questioning the cosmos was a capital offense. In the contemporary landscape, the barriers to knowledge are no longer physical or institutional in the same brutal manner. We possess vast digital archives, open-source educational platforms, and global libraries accessible instantly from a device in our pockets. Yet Bandel's argument in The Oak Matrix, Unleashed, remains pressing. The modern challenge to educational freedom is not a scarcity of information, but a deluge of noise, constant distraction, and sophisticated algorithmic manipulation. We face an overwhelming volume of unverified information and shallow discourse that can foster a new, modern kind of ignorance, one characterized by passive consumption rather than active suppression by a monarch or a pope.
The metaphor of the oak tree utilized in Bandel's chapter captures the necessary response to this chaotic modern landscape. A mighty oak requires deep, extensive roots to withstand severe environmental stress and storms. In the context of individual education, those roots represent foundational skills: reading comprehension, critical thinking, historical context, and philosophical inquiry. When an individual engages deeply with substantial texts, they build profound intellectual resilience. They learn to identify hidden biases, question prevailing narratives, and synthesize disparate pieces of information into a coherent worldview. This proactive pursuit of knowledge transforms a person from a passive recipient of media algorithms into an independent, empowered thinker who can navigate complexity without being swept away by it.
True educational freedom requires deliberate, sustained effort. It demands the discipline to read challenging material, to willingly confront perspectives that contradict our own established beliefs, and to recognize that intellectual autonomy is a continuous, lifelong process, not a final destination to be reached. The historical preservation of knowledge by ancient Egyptian scholars, medieval alchemists, and speculative builders serves as a potent reminder of the inherent value and enduring power of an educated mind. The responsibility now lies with the individual to utilize the vast resources available today to construct a sturdy, unshakable foundation for themselves. Share this episode with a friend who values the lifelong pursuit of knowledge and the hidden histories that shape how we think today.